Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about choke tube selection. Now, we've kind of talked about different aspects of chokes and shot selection and patterning and slugs and all that kind of stuff several times over the channel, but we haven't ever looked really hard at chokes, just the choke tubes themselves. Now, what are the origins of choke tubes? Well, for a long time, throughout the development of the shotgun, there have been a couple of pivotal changes. One of those was the development of choke tubes. Now, originally shotguns were just long tubes, right? No different than a rifle, really. It was the same diameter, internal diameter, all the way throughout. This would be what we call cylinder choke today. And the shotgun lent itself very well to a wide variety and types of ammunition. However, it had rather diminished range because of that. Eventually, somebody figured out that you could put a tapered area, a tapered inner diameter near the end of the bore, or at the end of the bore, and that would actually extend the overall range of the shotgun shell, the individual shot that you're trying to send out. Now, a lot of this has to do with the fact that as soon as a shot column exits the bore, it starts spreading out instantaneously. Now, it's not exactly like it covers an entire room. It's not like in video games and the movies where you shoot a shotgun down a hallway and you just control that entire hallway. The amount of time that the spread of the shot occurs as a function of distance and time. Now, if you compress that utilizing a choke, you change the overall dynamic with distance and time. The tighter you make it, the longer it takes for that shot to spread out over distance, which means that it travels a greater distance in a tighter overall shot column. Now, something else to keep in mind, guys, just to throw this out there, I've talked about this before, but I think it's always important to throw it back in there. Shot does not come out in just a wall of lead or steel or whatever it is that you're shooting. It actually has a shape that's more reminiscent of a cloud, which means that it has a height, a width, and a length associated with it, which means that not all of your shot shows up at the same time. So that's a very important aspect to keep in mind whenever we're talking about choke tube selection, shotgun shell length selection, as well as choke and patterning. So just some stuff there. It's not a two-dimensional target that you're shooting at, it's three-dimensional. And if you're utilizing a shotgun, it's probably because the target's moving. All right, so now, up until the 1960s, the vast majority of chokes would be fixed chokes. You'd have to swap out the barrel in order to be able to get a different type of choke in your particular shotgun. And a lot of barrels, especially when you're talking about pre-1940s, were fixed barrels. You didn't necessarily get the opportunity to just swap them out willy-nilly. In addition to that, there was such a thing that was developed called poly chokes, and this would be an external attachment to your barrel that would allow you, either by having interchangeable choke, having a choke tube that you removed and then plugged in a new one, or by rotating a collar, be able to select different chokes. Now, this obviously is a very interesting option, but in the 1960s, Winchester came up with the wind choke system, which involved a internally threaded choke tube to the actual barrel. So this way you didn't have to swap out barrels unless you wanted a different length. You could change out choke tubes at your will. You can see how this idea really took off, and now we have rem choke and a variety of other choke tube systems out of the market. All right, so there's kind of our background. Let's go ahead and start talking about choosing a choke for the individual situation. Now, we're going to talk a lot about probabilities of impacts at different distances and all this kind of stuff. Something else to keep in mind, guys, like I'm going to kind of throw down more or less like laboratory results for what it is that you should expect for distances and shot patterns for these particular chokes. But at the end of the day, in order to be able to figure out whether or not a given choke, load, shotgun, all that type of stuff is going to do what it is that you need it to do for your individual purpose, you need to take what you intend to use to the range and pattern it. And I actually have a separate video I'll throw in a link in the description discussing patterning, if that's something that you guys have an interest in. All right, so right off the bat, we already kind of touched on it, cylinder bore. So there is no change to the internal diameter. And this, along with improved cylinder, which has a tiny amount of change, are fantastic options for slugs, buckshot, and birdshot, and all those other types of things. If there's a specialty round that you want to put through a shotgun, cylinder and improved cylinder are the best options for that overall. So with cylinder, you're talking about a 40% impact of your shot load in a 30-inch circle at 40 yards. 40% of the load impacting inside of that circle. And that's the kind of laboratory-driven aspect of this, right? Because I personally would not be happy with a 40% impact on anything at 40 yards, and I would definitely not want to shoot a cylinder choke at 40 yards. Now, ideally, you would use cylinder choke at closer to like 20 to 30 yards would be your ideal engagement distance for that particular type of choke tube. All right, so that's cylinder choke. Let's go ahead and talk about skeet choke. Now, skeet choke is actually not that different from cylinder choke, and they're very similar. Skeet choke has a little bit more constriction that's associated with it. Either are fantastic options for close flushing birds or fast moving rabbits at relatively close range shots. Skeet choke is supposed to have a 50% shot load impact at 30-inch circle at 25 yards. So that kind of gives you an idea that this is a patterning type that is looking for wider patterns. And generally, you're talking about 15 to 20 yard shots with a skeet choke, and this is what makes it really advantageous in skeet type shooting, where generally, you know, if you're doing 5-stand or some of the positions in skeet require fairly close range shots on fast moving targets. So you can see where that type of more open choke would be very successful for that. Now, of course, you can run any of the different types of shot sizes and ammunition that you want to run through it. Now, in modified, because there are different variants of modified, and I don't necessarily want to get into that, because one of the key things in general with choke tubes, guys, is that across individual manufacturers, there are slightly different dimensions involved with these chokes. So one manufacturer might have what it calls a modified choke, but another manufacturer considers it to be a more like a full modified, or another manufacturer might consider it to be a light modified. So there's some variance in the overall internal dimensions. It's not necessarily something that I want to try to cover in this video because it is kind of elusive. All right, so with modified chokes, you're talking about being able to keep about 60 to 70% of your shot load on target on a 30-inch circle at 40 yards. And 40 yards is a pretty consistent engagement distance for the modified choke. Now, I like modified because I consider it to be fairly acceptable for close range shots as well as pretty good on long range shots. I've made 45-yard shots with modified chokes before and had zero issue with being able to make impacts, and I've also been able to take close shots with them. A lot of that, now it is going to be tighter than your skeet or your cylinder chokes, so some of that's going to take a lot of practice because you are talking about a much more narrow shot column at that point, but it is achievable. Of course, then again, there's also guys out there who shoot, claybirds with 9mm handguns, and that's definitely something I can't pull off. So that's kind of an individual basis thing, and it's definitely a training thing. Now, modified is where you also might see some manufacturers recommend that you can shoot slugs through modified chokes. And that's something that you kind of got to go to the individual manufacturer on. And that's an important thing with choke tubes in general. Whenever we talk about recommended types of ammunition to be able to put through them, check with your owner's manual. All right, now full chokes. Full chokes are considered to be the most amount of constriction that you can have. And this is when you're looking at getting closer to 80 to 90% of your overall shot pattern in a 30-inch circle at 40 yards. This is your long-range choke. This is the thing that you're supposed to be taking those kind of iffy long shots on perhaps turkey or waterfowl and all that kind of stuff. Now, something that's important to keep in mind is that full chokes may not have a lot of durability if you start utilizing steel shot. Now, there are plenty of people out there, I'm sure, who have done it. And they'll, maybe even be in the comments section talking about how they shoot steel shot through their full chokes all the time. They haven't had any issues. I would say that the important thing to keep in mind here is that manufacturers frequently recommend not shooting steel shot through full chokes. So their concern is that since steel doesn't necessarily compress all that well, that it could cause an overpressure event in your barrel. That's not good. That's not good long-term for your firearm. Now, speaking of constriction, with different types of chokes and all that kind of stuff, you might hear some people say that it might deform your shot if you go too tight on a particular choke with a given shot load, and it might deform the overall projectile. Something to keep in mind is that shotgun shot is not perfectly round to begin with. There's actually a lot of loose tolerances in the actual dimensions of shotgun shot when it comes to maybe not being oblong or something along those lines. So it's not as big a concern as some people might make it out to be. All right, so with full chokes, you may not want to run steel, shot, slugs, or buck shot either. And read your manual, go ahead, seek out get educated on the overall prospect so that you can make an informed decision from a position of knowledge instead of just going with whatever it is someone else told you to do. So don't necessarily take my word for it. I definitely implore you to look into that if you're planning on doing something along those lines. All right, so then we get into extra full chokes. Extra full chokes are special purpose chokes. You'll see them on turkey guns. You might see them in some waterfowl guns, though I doubt it. I actually have an extra full choke on my 10 gauge SB2 Harrington and Richardson shotgun, which if you're interested in that, check the description. There'll be a link there. But its extra full choke states do not shoot steel shot through it. And that is entirely because we're getting that super tight constriction. So now we're talking about a 60-yard shotgun, depending on the target and depending on the pattern and the shot load and all those types of things. Those play a part. So whereas with full chokes, we're getting like 50, 55, with extra full chokes, we're getting 60 to 65. And these are generally some sort of external choke tube. And what I mean by that is it still threads internally, but the choke tube itself extends outside of the muzzle in order to be able to have more space for that additional constriction and still be able to use a standard choke tube pattern and layout, length, thread, twist, all that kind of stuff. All those things that go into developing and actually manufacturing that type of stuff. It can utilize the standard stuff so that you can still swap in and improve cylinder afterwards if you want to, but it extends out far enough to actually be able to get that constriction that you're wanting in order to be able to have those longer range engagements. And I generally think of turkey guns whenever I think of that. All right, guys, that's pretty much a breakdown of how choke tubes work and what you should see for overall engagement distances and capabilities. I hope you guys found this interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.